All right, it's been a minute since I've been on this channel, but I am coming back with the intention to do regular updates, and I will start with today's update, with today's topic, which is deconstruction versus reconstruction. And to set that up, I want to just explain a bit more about what we're doing here on this channel, what I'm doing on this channel. I know it's been a while, and I want to reiterate what that sounds like for me at the moment, what that feels like as the creator of this channel, and kind of reissue an invitation. And hopefully if new folks are happening upon this video, that it serves as like an initial invitation. Like if this kind of work is appealing to you, is alluring to you, then hang out. There's more to come. So this channel, The Other Side of Complexity, is kind of inspired by, it's my channel. I might change the name as we go. But really it's inspired by this quote from Oliver Wendell Holmes, which is that I wouldn't give much for the simplicity on this side of complexity, but I would give my life for the simplicity on the other side of complexity. And I think in that quote, there is a wisdom, a knowing that says the answer is simple. Whatever I'm going to do, whatever action I need to take as a result of the chaos I might be in right now, or the complexity I find myself in, whatever is required of me, ultimately it's going to be a relatively simple set of steps that I will follow. I don't know what those are yet. Right now I can think of a simple way to resolve this problem that won't work. And until I navigate the complexity and engage with the complexity, I won't have a simple problem that will work. But I know that the answer will be simple. I often think of it as there's sort of like, if A is where the problem arises, if, let's say, point A is here, and point B is the solution we know we need to get to, and we know it's simple. To move from A to B directly is what, on the surface, it looks like needs to happen in a lot of cases where problem solving or troubleshooting or navigating uncertainty is at play. And it generally doesn't work. Moving straight from A to B, taking a direct path, with any kind of complex problem, it always skips what is beneath the surface. So the journey to get from, I'm mirroring myself, so I'm trying to learn how to draw. What I'm trying to draw is a U. So if A is here, B is here, we get to B, we get to a solution, we get to a simple solution, we get to know what the simple solution is by going into the depths a little bit and navigating the complexity. But the trick is we don't have to live in the complexity. We don't have to stay in the complexity. The solution isn't in the complexity. The solution is on the other side of complexity. And today's topic is deconstruction and reconstruction. And we might also say destruction. So deconstruction, destruction, and construction, reconstruction. And specifically what I'm talking about here is meaning. There is meaning inferred by the language that we use. There's meaning inferred by where we devote our time. There's meaning. We can look at our lives kind of retrospectively and see where we must have been in assuming meaning, not necessarily consciously, but unconsciously or kind of matter-of-factly by where we've put our time, our resources, our energy. This is about working with our minds. But deconstruction, reconstruction, and destruction, I mean them as applied to the way we see the world. So meaning is a part of the way we see the world. Most humans, for good chunks of their lives, see the world as meaningful and see their experience in this life as meaningful. And we know some of the ways that happens. It's not, I guess maybe a question to start with is like, where then do we draw meaning from? And I've made reference in other videos to a concept known as the spiral, or the spiral dynamics model of human development. And that model more or less suggests, based on like lots of evidence about how humans develop across cultures, within cultures, but like what the consistency is about human development across cultures. And the spiral dynamics model more or less says that depending on our state of development, which is typically a function of your societal state of development, societies develop at different stages. I'm not talking about economic development exclusively. This includes economic development, but we can look at societies and see that there's different value systems that exist depending on the stage that a society is at. So one very noticeable stage of societal development is different forms of fundamentalism. And fundamentalism, as I see it, is a belief that we have figured out the right way of doing things. We have figured out the way. Our people are the people who have figured out the way. And we will welcome other into our tribe, into our group, into our community, into our nation, into our village. But at the fundamentalist level of development, it is not possible for two fundamentalist societies to sustainably, peacefully coexist. Based on nothing more than the essence of that society's story of meaning, which says that we figured out that way. And one of the ways we know that fundamentalism is an unsustainable ticket, it's not a place we can stay, it's not a place to unpack your luggage. It feels safe when you're in it, when you're part of the chosen family, or you're part of the, on the inside of the community, when you have a sense of belonging within blue. And I say blue because that's the color it's associated with at the spiral dynamics, in the spiral dynamics model. Blue is fundamentalism. Blue is like a strong community sense, and like blue feels really good. Like if you've been in a community that takes care of itself, when you're in it, when you belong to it, it feels good. It does not feel good when you're on the outside of it, but if you're on the inside of it, there is a safety feeling. There is, I think it's the first moment really in it's not the first time that a we orientation, or that like a community orientation exists, but it's probably the one we're most familiar with in modern Western society. Of course, there are other forms of knowing, other forms of earlier stages of development that are communitarian, like the animistic stage, mythic stage of development. So we derive meaning from these different stages. I don't want to get into the stages too much in this video, because my focus is on reconstruction, destruction, and deconstruction. So what happens as we evolve through the stages? So if we think of the evolution that takes us out of fundamentalism, I'll use that as an example, out of the Christian nation state, the exclusively Christian nation state, out of the exclusively Muslim nation state, and into what's beyond that. The level beyond that is modernity. And modernity kind of like a big aspect of modernity is the fundamental dignity with which we respect the individual. And the way out of fundamentalism, the way to grow from a fundamentalist culture into the next stage of evolution or the next state of consciousness, is to start solving the problems that were generated at the fundamental level, at the fundamentalist level. So to take a scientific approach rather than a religious dogmatic approach to understanding the world, to finding the best solutions for just everyday problems, is one of the ways out of that, because it gives you evidence that, oh, there are things we can learn from other ways of knowing. We can objectively learn those things, and objective ways of knowing are kind of the best, because it's gives us this sense of certainty, and we're not reliant on groupthink or falling in line with the tribe in order to remain safe and have a sense of belonging. In fact, belonging isn't really that important at this stage, because there's this individual motivation to develop into the best man, the best woman, the best human, the best person I can be, that is very strong at the modern state of development beyond that fundamentalist stage. So then we start to take on new meaning at different stages of development, new stories of meaning, new patterns of sense making. And sense making is just like, how do we make story out of our sensory experience? Our sensory experience is the experience with which we navigate this world. And we realize, as we study the stages of human development, that the brain can actually kind of rewire itself, or the brain can slip into different modes. If you want to kind of think of the spiral stages as they're types, they're not types of people, they're types in people. So there's there's a version of each of those stages that I can go back and inhabit, if need be, the more well integrated I am. And, or maybe instead of go back and inhabit, it's better to say that I can draw on, that I can draw up as conscious lenses, which I can pursue the world. So I can look at things through the modern lens when that's the best lens to use, but I can also look at things through a more integrative lens, like a yellow lens, and say, how are all these modes of thinking, modes of being interacting together? But the reconstruction, the deconstruction happens sort of as you're maturing and as you start to identify the problems that exist within the stage of consciousness that you are at. And without understanding the stages of consciousness, deconstruction can be just relatively inefficient. You have to know, I think we have an impulse as humans who are growing and developing to, how do you say, convince other people that this is the right way to go, to take people with us. It's nicer to go on certain journeys with company, and that's certainly something that I found in my development, is that it can be a lonely journey if the folks nearby aren't coming along for the ride. And in my experience, it's rare that people can, because we're all at unique stages of our own development and we're all on our own journeys, but you end up finding people that share the worldview that you're moving into. But there is a necessary deconstruction that happens. So I think one that I would say people in my generation, that's probably a common kind of deconstruction that we've gone through, is a deconstruction of how power works, a deconstruction of how systems function to oppress or to limit all of us in some ways, and specific groups that are disadvantaged already, in many ways because of the power systems that we exist within. And that's like a necessary thing. I just want to name that. It's a necessary thing to deconstruct the thought system of each stage of consciousness as you develop through it. Because once you identify problems, there's a pull towards solution finding. And if you don't accept that call, accept that pull, you're just going to experience the same problems over and over again. And that's stagnation. So we want ourselves to grow and move and solve problems that we didn't realize yesterday. When we realize the problems, that is when we begin the process of resolving them. And it can take time. But the deconstruction process is personal. I guess that's part of what I'm intending to share. And we can have companionship on that journey. Like, it is easy to find, especially with power, it is easy to find people who will engage in the deconstruction with you, right? There are other people who are there. And then some people are not there. Some people are not in a deconstruction mode. So if you're in the mode of deconstruction and you're looking at the systems, looking at the economic systems, if you're looking at the political systems, it is helpful to your understanding to understand how they function and why they produce the results that they do. And it's helpful to our collective understanding, the more of us that have that knowledge. And it is helpful for people who are doing the deconstruction to connect with one another and say, hey, this is how this is manifesting in my life specifically. So there's like an outer layer of like, I can look at the world and the people who are suffering and the people who are in need of humanity's aid that are not getting it. And I can tell you a story because I've done my deconstruction work about why they're suffering, about without even really having met them necessarily, met the people belonging to different groups. I can read books. I can get the mimetic code that tells me what is the consensus among people who have thought about it, about why these people, different groups, different geographic areas, different racial groups, different, there's disparities across the globe between men and women, between heteronormative folk and people who do not conform or exist, have any desire to live a heteronormative lifestyle. There are distinctions. Our world is made of distinctions and difference, and some of those distinctions are unfair. Those distinctions are really unfair, or some of the ways those distinctions manifest are really unfair, and it's impossible to deny, when you look at statistics, how someone's circumstances, socioeconomic circumstances, circumstances that are a result of the lottery of birth and just ending up in one place where it is practically much more challenging to achieve the same results and outcome and quality of life as folks from different places. And that's unfair. So I can tell that story. I know a lot of people who can tell the story of why the world is unjust. It typically involves naming capitalism. It typically involves, elevating, surfacing, making conscious certain social narratives that are perhaps, or were perhaps, innocent sounding when we learned them as children, or even innocent sounding now. But when you actually deconstruct them, you can see the function that they serve. So think of deconstruction as it's like actually a building. And if we're deconstructing the building, we're taking it apart piece by piece. We're not destroying it, but we're taking it apart piece by piece, and we're seeing okay, This is what it's made of. Like, it's made of these pieces. And now that we see what's on the inside, we can, it becomes easier to see why things were so unfair because of the design of the system and the design of the story. And when I think of destruction, it is more like blowing up a building. It's like saying that capitalism isn't working. Destruction's bad. Deconstructing capitalism and destroying capitalism are two different things. There's like a real important function that capitalism is serving right now that we do not have a replacement for as a society. If we destroyed it, I don't know what would happen. And I say this not as being like, economics isn't a strong area for me. It's not an area I've devoted a significant amount of study to. But what I have devoted study to is understanding how systems evolve and change and how social systems exist. So if we're looking at something like capitalism, this may not be the right metaphor, but it's almost like the mitochondria in a way of the globe. And it's like, none of this is meant to say that it's healthy, but simply to say that it's serving a function, and it's probably serving functions that we can't fully understand. And we would understand them better if we had sort of been, 1,000-year-old beings that evolved along with it, but we can't because we're new. And that is a blind spot. We're new in a culture that doesn't have, at least my culture, a tradition of protecting and honoring elder wisdom, where we might store a lot of that knowledge, and where a lot of that knowledge is stored. But there are cultures where it's like, culturally, you don't have to like I can go talk to elders, and I do, but it's not part of the social structure. It's part of my internal structure for I like being around old people who have more experience on this earth than I do. But destruction would be to destory, or just to like destroy everything that is capitalism. And then what would be left on the other side would be like, we'd have to try and figure out what functions it was serving and what functions it wasn't serving. So deconstruction would allow us to actually see that as we slowly like peel away the layers and say like, what elements do we need to preserve and what elements are causing dysfunction? What elements are toxic to the whole? And some of the ones that like are kind of obvious that come to mind are, well, there's a legal system in a lot of countries that says companies operating in a capitalist regime have to prioritize the interests of their shareholders, and the market actually punishes companies that take the time to make sure their products are safe, to take the time to make sure they're not doing unconscious harm by creating something, by drawing on a certain natural resource, by building or constructing or developing in a way that causes a certain waste product to be produced and disposed of in a way that's not going to be easy for future generations to deal with. I need to get a mount for this camera that is not on my desk because I would love to lean, and that just makes it shaky. But ultimately, there has to be a reconstruction, right? There has to be a reconstruction on the other side of destruction, or deconstruction, ideally. And some of us are engaged in that already. Some of us are like actively in like reconstruction mode. And that is a different mode of being. I don't think you ever fully leave. Like if you've deconstructed something, your tendency to deconstruct, your ability to deconstruct will be with you always. Your tendency to deconstruct is something of choice. It can become a response that you choose. And the other part of like what happens in reconstruction is that like you get a sense of what you can let go of the deconstruction or the tearing down. Like maybe, I mean, I've certainly experienced this, that it's like the more I practice, there's just a sense of like I'm way more valuable reconstructing things. I'm way more valuable and useful and helpful, and it feels better, and I get more positive feedback if I'm building something. And because we're all at different phases, and because some of us haven't gone through a reconstruction phase yet, some of us are still deconstructing, or some of us get stuck in deconstruction mode. Or distracted or confused. I think a natural endpoint maybe is a better way to bridge to how reconstruction might work. A natural endpoint for our deconstruction work is like an emptying almost. And I would say this is like an interior phenomenon. There's a sentiment that like deconstruction is what social change is. That like just naming how power is broken. It's like that's social change. That's for social change. But I think what happens to people who are have a little bit of bravery to sort of like follow their intuition and not the crowd, because a challenge on the deconstruction path is that if you're deconstructing and your peers are deconstructing and insights start occurring to you about what in the system you would like to protect, what the system has meaning that you want to retain, while your peers are doing only deconstruction or maybe destruction, and are developing, like we're developing a worldview here. So the problems, you encounter problems with deconstruction work. It is really difficult to work in a group when you're deconstructing, when you're noticing the patterns of dysfunction in the group, but not the patterns of possibility. It is really difficult to be in dialogue with people at different stages of psychological development when you're deconstructing. When you're constructing, and we'll come back to the space in between in a minute, but like when you're constructing, you don't actually have to be at the same level of development as the people that you're working with, because a lot of people who are in building, constructing, meaning mode, if you're telling a story that like broadly resonates with what their experience is, and they also want to create, to build, to prosper, to thrive, to grow, people in construction and creation mode aren't looking for fights, aren't looking for battles. If you're like solidly anchored there, that's a place where collaboration across difference, including difference of worldview, can happen. But if you're in deconstruction mode, there's probably someone in the room who is not. And they're not going through it with you. And they may be like levels behind you. And we have this inclination, there's two inclinations we have as humans when it comes to inferring what's happening in other people's minds. both of them are distortions. We either assume that the people around us think the same as we do, especially when like they laugh at our jokes, when we have good conversations with them, and we have this felt sense of moving in the same direction. And it's not always true. Nobody has the same experience as you. And people are at unique stages of development and on unique paths that have unique roles in this world. So when we're deconstructing, we're probably attacking some of those people because those are stable identity structures, stable structures of consciousness, stable ways of knowing. And there is something like a shadow of the deconstruction phase is that like the point of the deconstruction is I can reveal this to others and then the change will happen. Or maybe then they will turn to me and look for advice. And it's hard to get good advice, hard to give good advice when you're deconstructing. It's a mode of being. I have not met many who are deconstructing, and I don't know if I've met any who are able to carry on the work of deconstruction and are leaders that I would want to follow at the same time. I think that's a caution that I have. And I'm getting a little flag that says my disk space is running out. So I'll see if I can delete something while we're chatting. And my clutter. So yeah, if you're attacking someone who's not actively deconstructing. Okay, yeah, no, that's where I left it. Leadership. What people want in a leader is constructivism. They want to know where to go and what they're doing. And I think part of the reason I'm reluctant to follow people that are like in active deconstruction mode, part of the reason why leadership is challenging from that mindset is because I think a lot of people leave the deconstruction phase. And I think that like the natural way is to like, you've deconstructed everything. This world don't work. You read the news. The natural way to transcend the deconstruction phase or the destruction phase as you move out of particularly like the postmodern meme of consciousness, the meme of consciousness or the level of consciousness where we deconstruct power, the necessary level of consciousness where we deconstruct power. We don't leave that phase no longer caring about power, but I think the natural evolution for someone who is practicing self-awareness, not just practicing looking out at the world and saying, what is wrong with the world? How do we fix it? How do we create the conditions that are life-sustaining and generative for the world that we all know is possible, just like at the simple level, like a life-sustaining society. Like right now we've reached our planetary boundaries. We are putting too much of certain kinds of gases into the atmosphere, certain kinds of chemicals into the ocean. Plastic is everywhere. Politics is polarized. We're in this like multipolar, unstable, like international political climate. Like something needs to change, right? Like something needs to change in our external world. It makes sense that we put our focus there while we're deconstructing power. And I think the natural endpoint, I know the natural endpoint of deconstructing power in the external world is a realization of the nature of power, is a realization of what we as individuals experiencing life distinct from the whole. How we can actually affect the whole. Not only how we can affect the whole, but how the whole of the external world that we were frustrated with is inside of us. How like we have normalized and integrated all of the messages that the world has sent us about who we are, about what the world is, about what has meaning and value. And the end of that deconstruction phase is really, I think, ideally, it's like a surrender of a way of thinking about the world that has ceased to be fruitful for us. And maybe it's not power that is the way through. Power is a common one because it's in the culture right now that we're talking about capitalism. We're talking about the political system. We're talking about the patronage that exists between the political and the economic systems. Patronage is the word that we use here in Nova Scotia to call behavior related to like favorable treatment of allies by the governing parties. That's one way in. And I think there's like this tempting thing that happens when we deconstruct all the way, where it might appear like there's nothing after the deconstruction. It can be tempting to believe that we have to construct a new order. And that I find is particularly, it's an understandable development, but it's a troubling one, that it is very common to see problems of the world and then think, I've got to go establish a whole new order as president or as leader of a nation or as governor of a state or as leader of a movement that's trying to gain power within the government. And I think what really moves out of kind of like what can be a hyper focus on understanding how the system works now and what's broken about it, what I found really moved me into a higher state of consciousness was like a surrender and acceptance that like, not only is there a power in me that I had unrecognized, that there's also powers in the universe, higher powers. You might call them like larger plot lines to reality, of which I am included, but are not plot lines which I have control over. And that there are patterns playing out that like, if I'm not aligned with them, there's no room for my wants are, it's like swimming upstream. Like if I want and desire and act with the intention of changing things in obliviousness to these larger structures of reality, like there is a moral arc of the universe that bends towards justice. We know that. That is a tendency. We know that the universe as experienced and constructed, like it's unreasonable to expect fairness. Expectation of fairness is a cognitive distortion because we're confused about the moral arc that bends towards justice. We don't have justice. We have never had justice. We may never have justice, but we know that there's a plot line to reality that can be best described as a moral arc that bends towards justice. So on the other side of the deconstruction, when you start to attune to some of these, we could call them plot lines of reality, not moral absolutes, but absolutes, like bankable realities that are backed by the universe. Then we as constructionists, we as builders, we as visionaries of society, we as people who are trying to move the world in a direction that we simply feel drawn towards moving. It's less thoughty and more like, for me, everything changed when I watched Star Trek, The Next Generation. It was like, there was so much in that show that was like, yes, of course, if we make it, of course, if humanity survives this ecological crisis we're living through, if we survive all the wars, there are going to be so many elements for society that are just like what Star Trek described. At least in like, the large, as far as the plot lines are concerned. Meaning is not going anywhere. So there is a meaning embedded in these plot lines that includes a moral ought, that includes an answer to how ought the world be. Excuse me. The world is a certain way, and a big part of our psychological growth and development is about seeing the world as it is and accepting the world as it is and surrendering to how it is. But there also is an ought, which is why it can be difficult to surrender to the way things are. So there's an is and an ought. And we realize that like on the other side of this is like our job not to fix everything, but to feel personally called to address some of the oughts. And that might be as simple as you walk into a space and it's quiet and there's people kind of like mulling about and it's kind of awkward, and you notice there's a Bluetooth speaker at the side of the room, and you know you're going to be there for a while with these people, and you just say there ought to be music. Like there ought to be some nice background music that we could have on to make it less like hospital-like, waiting room-like. Or the ought might be, hey, like I'm actually the only one that can solve conflicts in my family, and there are conflicts happening, and I need to go and be the resolution, be the mediator, be the conflict engager, the one who can actually make this happen safely. So where from like the deconstructionist standpoint, it's like, it felt pretty big when I was like stuck in this phase. And deconstructing, it doesn't feel good either. Like ultimately in your body, there's I think we know in our hearts, at least at some level, this is not the way. Like this is not the way to the solution. You get that response from the feedback you get from people who are not deconstructing, and people who are deconstructing. That's a different thing. But it was a lot to be focused on, in the idea of, I think there's also an idea in the deconstructionist phase that like, that is it's just a big task. And as long as we're thinking about our task is, whether we're doing it alone or with other humans, to create a better world, not actually fully understanding all the problems of this world, only having looked at sort of the power lens, the power dimension of the way society is structured, not necessarily looking at the communitarian dimension. That's something that, among folks on the left, we could do some work on that. We could do some work on learning how to build spaces that like literally everybody belongs to, because if we're excluding people from our circle of care, we're not tending to the whole. And it's probably not terribly intuitive when you're in that phase, how simple or what the simplicity on the other side of complexity that you're going through in the deconstruction phase is. But the simplicity is often simple and intimate, simple and personal. Like, I don't have a strong bent anymore that like I need to address everything, that I need to name everything that is dysfunctional, because there's actually so much dysfunction between what I see as like the ought of the world and the is of the world. The way things are very dysfunctional, and they ought not be. But I am not the one to bridge it all. I'm not the one to like stitch that together. I'm not the one to make, to construct a perfect story. And my guess is neither are you. But what is true is that like I have unique work to do. I have unique skills and abilities, but more importantly, like I'm a human with a unique human experience, unique human perspective. And I am like every other human in the way that I am unique, but my uniqueness and your uniqueness is an expression that is entirely unique, has never been experienced before, will never be experienced again. And it's from this sense of knowing that I can start to construct the reality that is mine to construct. And I do that by being attentive to the isness of the world, by being aware of the oughts as I navigate life, and being attentive to which of those oughts are personally compelling, are personally alluring, are personally like there's often just like an inner resonance, or I'll find myself moving towards someone or some place where the work that I'm to do is to be done. And for me, I'm a musician. Often that's a musical thing. Often that's, but I'm also a sense maker. I'm also a writer. I'm also other things that are part of an integrated identity that some call unique self. I call unique self. Belong to a school of thought that calls this unique self. That like there's actually plenty of work for me specifically to do. Not much of it includes deconstruction. Sometimes it does. Sometimes that's part of correcting. If you're working on a project, it's important to name some of the things that other people say that do not make sense and are not coherent. And the way you do that, one of the ways you can do that is through deconstruction. But it's a different kind of deconstruction. It's a deconstruction. It's not destruction, that's for sure. It's a deconstruction that understands there is work to do on the other side of the deconstruction project. And that work is very personal, and that whoever I'm talking to, or if I'm deconstructing something within my own consciousness awareness, that the deconstruction must be in service of it enabling me or the person I'm engaged with in being their best expression, their highest expression of self, their unique expression of self that only they can serve. Because it's like that's actually what needs to be protected. If we are to deconstruct something, I think what emerges along the way that is not obvious initially is what the deconstruction is for. It's not initially obvious what the deconstruction is for. We just feel compelled to deconstruct things that don't make sense. And on the other side of the deconstruction, it becomes obvious that the work is very personal and simple and intuitive to us. It's not up to us to resolve everything. Nor is it up to us to create everything or conceive of everything. There are other forces at work in the universe that are doing the heavy lifting. And I don't actually have heavy lifting to do. And you don't actually have heavy lifting to do. If it's heavy, it's not your work. If it's heavy, it's somebody else's work. I know I say this with more compassion, but like, if something is so heavy, I'll say it from a first person perspective. When things have been so heavy in my life, it is with hindsight that I look back on those things and realize that I was trying to carry something that wasn't mine, or I was trying to offer something that I was in no position to offer, that was none of my business to offer. I was trying to do something that was beyond what any of my peers, what God above expected of me. And the heaviness was a signal to like, take a step back, man, take a step back. Like, just think through, like, is this yours to take? If it's yours, it should, your work should feel like your baby, is what I'm learning. And when it stops feeling like your baby, and you don't always love taking care of a baby, right? It's like taking care of babies, they're hard. I don't have a baby. I have nephews. I have nieces. I'm taking care of them, and they're not babies anymore. But you just know when it's like, it's not always pleasant. But there's a knowing of like what's yours to take. All right, that's deconstruction, reconstruction, destruction in however many minutes this is. I cut it up into a few different videos. So please let me know how this lands in the comments. We are here. I am here. I'm making videos about this. This kind of stuff, the space between stories, this moment in time we're living in. And I think it is an active project that we must all be engaged in, or as many of us who are aware of what's at stake must be engaged in. We've reached planetary boundaries. We've got terrible political polarization. We've got just really elementary skills as a species for resolving conflict, and to being in genuine dialogue and seeing reality clearly. And really elementary skills in terms of visioning the future. So these are all things that I am focused on in my life, and I'm focused on in bringing you in this channel, where we'll do sense making, talk about how we orient ourselves, how we navigate this world, this reality, this complex time, and make meaning, ultimately. How do we make meaning of this moment and our future? That's what we're going to be exploring here on this channel. There's a Substack as well. I sometimes publish there. Search for The Other Side of Complexity on Substack. And find me on Blue Sky, Mark Coffin. And yeah, please share how this lands with you, if this coheres with what you're already learning and how you're already making sense of this moment. Anything I might have missed. It was a free talk, so I don't know to what standard of completeness anybody was expecting. But until next time.